Hi guys, welcome back to Why Do I? Today's episode is one that I'm really, really excited about. We're going to talk about anger, but in a slightly different context. Now, I have an anger problem, and it's not something that I'm afraid to admit. But my anger problem isn't because I'm overly angry. My anger problem is because I don't really feel it. I don't experience it. When people talk about anger, I struggle to connect with that. And that's what we're going to go into, and specifically the relationship of anger and how it plays out in relationships. And today, I'm very, very lucky to be joined by an amazing guest, someone called Sam Parker. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Why are you sat on the sofa with me today?
Well, I've written a book about exactly what you just described, which is the other anger problem of suppressing and repressing it, the toll that takes on us, and how you can get a little bit better at using anger for good reasons.
Brilliant. And Sam, I just wanted to intro with the first question. What led you to the book? Why did you want to investigate that sort of element of anger?
So I was someone who thought that anxiety was my lot in life. It's something I struggled with when I was a kid, through my teens, through my 20s. And I tried to deal with it in a couple of different ways, some healthy, some unhealthy. So I'd rely on alcohol in social situations. And then in my better moments, I'd try things like meditation and jogging and gratitude journaling and everything that millionaires on podcasts tell you to do. And none of it really worked for me. And what started to work through a combination of professional help and my own reading about 8 years ago was getting in touch with anger. And what I realized was that for me, the opposite of anxiety wasn't relaxation or, peacefulness or like trying to learn to chill out. It was actually learning how to express anger properly. The relationship between anger and depression is pretty well defined. Freud wrote about it 100 years ago in Mourning and Melancholia when he looked at the difference between depression, which was then called melancholia, and mourning, the natural sad state that we enter when we lose someone. And what he identified was that the secret ingredient in melancholia was anger that has a rightful place out in the world being directed against the self, right? And so that's where we got this idea of depression being anger turned inward. But what's less well known, I think, is that anxiety can also be a manifestation of anger that you're holding on to. And so people who have the dysfunctional relationship with anger, along the lines that you described at the beginning of the show, where it's actually about anger makes you feel really uncomfortable. It makes you feel scared. It makes you feel ashamed. That can often manifest as anxiety. And so that's what I figured out about myself. And I just thought this is something that isn't really being talked about a lot in the mental health conversation, which has come on a long way in recent years, of course. And a lot of the stigma's been taken out of things like depression and anxiety. But we haven't really started talking about the role that anger plays in it because it's such a tricky conversation for a lot of people.
Yeah, this is fascinating. There's so many different angles that I'd like to talk to you about. But I mean, this show first and foremost is about people understanding themselves and improving their ability to build relationships with others. So I wonder if we could just start a little bit with that idea of anger being stigmatized. Why is it stigmatized? What in your research, like, why do you think it's got such a bad rep as an emotion?
The number one reason is that we conflate anger with aggression
Right.
all the time, to the point where if I was to say to you, I saw such and such the other day and they were angry, you quite often picture in your head someone, ranting and raving, being in some kind of confrontation. If I was to say I saw someone the other day and they were sad, you wouldn't automatically assume they were like curled up in a ball crying somewhere, right?
Yeah.
You separate between the emotion and the behavior. For some reason with anger, we don't do that. And so because people conflate it with aggression and even violence very readily, it tends to be a topic that people feel it was an emotion that feels taboo for people. There's long and complicated cultural reasons why, historical reasons why anger is seen as a taboo. It's on the list of the 7 deadly sins, so it goes right back to the beginning of Christianity. But I think more pertinently, many of us grow up in homes where our anger as children is punished in some way by our parents, anger in return, or their fear, or their neglect, their abandonment in some form. And so we internalize this idea that our expression of our anger is something that's not safe for us. And what we don't often do is then become adults who find the healthy way to express anger. We actually, in many cases, become people who just keep it kind of suppressed.
Yeah, right.
And, you meet many people, and I talk about this in the book, and I was one of them, perhaps you've been one of them, who will say, I'm not really an angry person. I don't really get angry.
Yeah.
right? But if you were to hear someone say that about any of the other core emotions,
Right.
I never get sad, I never get happy,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
never get afraid, you'd think something isn't adding up there, you know? But we don't think that when people say it about anger. We just assume they're chilled,
Yeah.
but inside they're often not.
I gotta say, this is so relatable to me because I am not an angry person, and I've always worn that almost as a badge of honor. But through doing quite a lot of therapy and self-reflection, I understand the reason why I'm not an angry person. And that's because I know that subconsciously I view it as a negative emotion, right? And that comes from my childhood. That the viewers of the show will know my background, and I was someone who suffered a lot of abandonment as a kid, and what that meant was I would lash out because I desperately wanted to be acknowledged by the people that abandoned me, and often how that would manifest itself would be me becoming very, very angry and being frustrated
Yeah.
because I wanted those people to acknowledge me and love me. And that created a lot of problems, right, in my relationships as a child, as a teenager, specifically for my mum, who's the person who I put on an absolute pedestal, right? I've often been described as a mummy's boy, and I don't take that as an insult at all. But the challenge I had was when I grew up and I started to understand the impact that that raw emotion had on her, or not specifically the emotion, but the manifestation of it would be something that I would avoid because I just had this negative bias towards it. And honestly, mate, I don't think that I've ever come to terms with that and thought of a way that I can express my anger in a slightly more positive way.
Yeah, and I can relate to what you're describing. It's a very complicated issue because for a mother, a teenage boy's anger, let's say, can be a very frightening thing. Like teenage boys are big and loud, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's a very, I think that's a fairly like common experience actually. And what we do with boys is that culturally we kind of say you're allowed to be angry and aggressive, and there's some value in that. There's almost some sort of pride in that in certain contexts, but you're never encouraged to be curious about why you're angry and to kind of look at what your anger is telling you about yourself, not just the thing that's triggered you.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we go wrong with boys. With girls, we tend to give a different message, which is that your anger is unattractive, unacceptable, shameful, and so on. So there's a lot to unpick, I think, and it does start very early.
And do you find in the research that you've done that the way that anger ends up manifesting itself or, coming out of people, does that differ depending on whether you're a man or a woman?
It's complicated. There are differences. The perception, the false perception, is that anger is somehow a male emotion predominantly, and that really goes back to the aggression confusion, because men, as we know, are more prone to violence in society. They take more risk-taking behavior. All of these things, they're more likely to get into confrontations. So there's always been this idea going right back to ancient times that men are somehow the dominantly angry gender. Actually, it's been studied since around the 70s from a psychological point of view by Arnold H. Buss and some other sort of pioneering anger researchers. Do men and women feel anger in different degrees or amounts? And the conclusion throughout all the decades until now is that actually there's no real difference in feeling anger.
Right.
So again, if you separate the emotion and the behavior,
Yeah.
actually there's more evidence recently by certain polling from around the world that women are overtaking men in terms of how much they report feeling angry.
Right.
But what they then do with that, of course, is different. And yeah, there's still the tendency for women to suppress and men to lose their temper.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And I mean, like I said at the top of the show, I can't remember the last time I felt genuine anger, but I do often feel very frustrated.
Mhm.
And it's often at times when people will ask a lot of me, right? When I feel like I am struggling to meet the needs of everyone that needs me as well as my own needs. But um, what that'll often manifest as is feeling overwhelmed and feeling stressed out. I never really, I have this feeling in my chest, but I never really feel like I'm able to express it.
Yeah.
And you spoke a little bit, and when we did our prep call, you spoke about how people can kind of deal with it. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm really interested in this because, there are certain different schools of thought. And one of those schools of thought is relax. One of those schools of thought is express. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
So how you process anger and
Yeah.
feel it. I think identifying it is a big challenge for a lot of people. And it was interesting to hear you then say you described it as a sort of a feeling there. And lots of people do that.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a certain reluctance to name it anger,
Right.
right? We feel uncomfortable
Absolutely.
even doing that.
Yeah.
And so learning to identify it in your body is a really good like first step. If you're someone who doesn't have a very, let's say, intimate relationship with your anger, or you struggle to accept that it's there, learning to identify it in your body and then labeling it, even just to yourself and then increasingly to other people,
Mm.
is a really good way to get familiar with the terrain. And I always say that, that has to be the first step. And people try and jump ahead to the expression.
Mm.
And this is where you get into sort of rage rooms and certain sort of screaming into a pillow type therapies, which I think have some value in terms of you can try an aggressive mode out and see how it feels and
Yeah.
things. But I think you have to start with learning how to identify the emotion in yourself first, and also understanding, as you just outlined, why it is that you struggle with it. Like,
Yeah.
what's your personal history with this emotion, and why does it trouble you? Does it make you feel ashamed? Does it make you feel afraid,
Mm.
anxious? So there's a lot you can figure out before you get to the point of like, how do I actually express it out in the world,
Sure.
which is its own challenge.
Your desire to sort of research around this subject, you talked about it when you introduced yourself, but could you see it having an impact on your personal relationships? Was that kind of the instigator?
100%.
Yeah.
I I was probably what you would call like a classic people pleaser,
Right.
conflict avoidant. I still am that by nature a lot of the time. I have to clock it and circumnavigate it a lot.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that I tried to move through the world from childhood forward into my 20s and early 30s was to keep the peace for everyone and try and keep everyone happy. And,
Yeah.
and it's easy to tell yourself that there's something sort of noble or mature about that, something sort of enlightened about it. But there comes a point where actually you do have to defend yourself, and you do have to be able to have direct, difficult conversations with people. And you do have to be able to say, I'm angry with something that you've done.
Mm.
And if you don't have that tool, if you don't have that ability, then you're going to be kind of limited in how you can move through the world and how you can influence people and how authentic your relationships can be, right? And even so that is definitely true in professional contexts. If you think about it in the context of romance,
Mm.
I was somebody who could only express anger in that context when I'd sort of been pushed to my limit or felt pushed to my limit, and then I would kind of explode and then sort of carry on like nothing had happened.
Yeah.
Um, that's not a great way to manage your relationship, the most important relationship in your life, often, which is your intimate relationship with your partner. And so when I started to unpick the difficulties that I had with this and be more thoughtful about it, and look, it was an 8-year process that I'm still on now, it does start to improve things at work, at home, and continues to for me. And you continue to slip back into the old patterns, of
Mm.
course, like you do with everything. But when you can pull yourself towards something more deliberate about your relationship with anger and how you express it, it does start to make things a lot better for you.
And I suppose I think the one relatable thing which the audience is going to take from this is that idea of anger as being expression as opposed to like an inwards looking thing.
Mm,
Because my interpretation of that in my own relationship is that I will never express any negative emotion towards my partner until it comes to a point where I'm like, I cannot not express this. And often what will happen is I'll just get gradually more and more pissed off, and it's never her fault, right? But she will often be the trigger because the person closest to you is
mm,
normally the person that you feel the most comfortable
right.
expressing yourself in that way with.
Yeah.
And then to your point, I'll just explode and I'll snap. And there are loads of different reasons why that isn't appropriate. And one of those is about safety, like protection. Like I'm, big, strong man, and
Mm,
she can probably feel a little bit intimidated by that. And if that then it reduces the neutrality in your relationship
mhm,
because she might feel worried that she's going to get more aggressive behavior, whether that's verbal, or otherwise. But
yeah.
um, I find it really, really interesting. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, how can you work with your partner to start talking about that stuff better?
Mm. A really powerful thing you can do is talk about anger when you're not angry. We tend to only talk about the things that piss us off once we've been pissed off,
Yeah.
and we kind of have to. And there's a lot of value in having like a proactive conversation with your partner when you're both actually in a really good place,
Mm.
about what it is that pushes your buttons about each other. And not only that, but why you think it may be. there's an expression, if it's hysterical, it's probably historical.
Mm.
And so, if you're losing your temper with your partner and once you've calmed down that it wasn't a proportional response to whatever it is they said or did or didn't do, you kind of got to really analyze in yourself, well, what was that really about? What was it reminding me of? What wound from the past was it pointing me towards? And like often these things are patterns, and your partner will have them and so will you. You might express them differently, but you'll both have them. And having that understanding of each other's sort of anger map gives you that shorthand to repair when you do fall out. Like, it's not going to stop you arguing,
Yeah.
but it does give you both that kind of extra bit of empathy for what's going on with each other in the moment. And so I think that's something that I found helpful. There are other slightly more practical things you can do. I mean, the most famous anger advice in the world is count to 10, which is an infuriating thing to be taught to do when you've lost your temper.
Yeah.
But the truth is that when anger has tipped over into you've lost it, and you have the amygdala hijack of it, and you might as well have been punched in the head. You can't articulate yourself, you can't think rationally, you can't act calmly. Take yourself, have a time out for about 20 minutes. And physiologically, that's actually the amount of time you need for your nervous system to reset and so on. And the thing to do in that time is not rehearse all the reasons why you're right and they're wrong and what you want to say when you resume the argument. It's to, like, if you can, go and listen to a podcast or read a book or something.
Yeah.
Take your mind off the argument.
Yeah.
And then come back to it when you've had that chance to reset biologically. It's really, really hard to do, but yeah, I think having that proactive conversation with your partner about this stuff is a decent step towards, just repairing that bit quicker.
But I would hypothesize that more often than not, when it comes to those like highly tense conflict situations with a partner, it's not them that's made you angry in the first place. It's something probably a lot deeper than that, or it's a combination of factors. They just happen to be the vehicle in which you're channeling it through.
Yeah, I think you should think of anger and all emotions as sources of information. And there's generally 3 buckets of information that anger has. And one is dead simple. It's a boundary violation. If I was to throw that glass of water over you now, you'd be angry, and rightly so,
I'd
right?
say, thank you, Sam.
Yeah, good anger. You'd respond to that violation with some of your own healthy aggression, and that would be the appropriate thing to do. That, unfortunately, isn't usually what happens when we get angry. Normally, it's about one of 2 other buckets that you've been alerted to, an unmet need that you have, which is usually for respect from someone, for appreciation from someone for something that you're doing.
Yeah.
You might get angry with someone at work for the way they talk to you, and when you analyze it, they were a bit rude, but really it's because you're worried your boss doesn't respect you enough in this area. That's useful information, because then you can go and work on that, right? The third bucket, which is complex and more what we're talking about, I think, is it's alerting you to a wound from your past.
Right.
Parents with kids often get triggered in this way. Their kids make them angry, and they can be furious. And on one level, it's because kids can be annoying, but also that the kid doesn't mean it. They're 3 years old. You can't really hold them responsible. It's reminding you of a feeling of disempowerment or frustration that you had when you were a kid.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's something there that you need to work on and think about in a different context. And so in relationships too, like thinking about, like, what is the information in this for me, not just the information about them and what they've done.
And it's honestly, when you sit here and it's 2 rational people talking about it rationally,
Yes.
it feels very easy.
It's easy, right?
Yeah. But I guess that's your point around talk about anger at a time when you're not angry.
Come back to it later. Yeah, don't let it be something that you sweep under the rug.
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose for a lot of people, particularly when it expresses itself in quite extreme ways, it can probably be very embarrassing, place the facts, to want to reflect on that.
Not a shame.
Yeah. I'm not a violent person at all. So sometimes, and this is slightly controversial, sometimes I feel maybe I need to be more violent, because I feel like, and to your point, in a very, very safe way, but because I feel like sometimes I feel this tenseness in my body, and I feel like the only way that I'm going to be able to channel that is through physicality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose for me, again, hypothesizing, that would be maybe a difference between men and women, that maybe you channel these things in different ways.
I'm not sure that there's a difference between men and women in terms of the way, the body can be used as a sort of a map and an expressive tool for anger. Perhaps there are.
Yeah.
Certainly there'll be different tendencies. But I think the physiological, that kind of scratchy feeling that you're describing,
Mm.
another thing that people don't often talk about with anger is not just that it has wisdom in it for us, information in it for us, but a hell of a lot of energy.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the most energizing emotion there is,
Right.
hands down.
Yeah.
And if you can channel that energy into doing something constructive, it might be a sport where you're kind of, acquiring a skill, let's say, because you're getting better at a sport or something. Or I've used this example before. I've fallen out with my partner and been angry, and I've gone and like tidied the shit out of the kitchen, just to like do something with the energy,
Yeah.
and also to show her that really I'm a great person, and she should be upset with me because so you can or go and do something in your shed or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You can take that energy and you can channel it into something that's useful. And actually, I talk about this in the book, but there's a lot of great art that has angry stories behind it,
Uh-huh.
where people have taken that scratchy, frustrated feeling, and rather than address it socially, which is generally the way you should approach it if you're angry with somebody, for some reason that's not appropriate or not what they want to do, they go and channel it into music or writing or whatever it is. So there's lots of things you can do with that energy other than just grit your teeth and clench your fists.
And then you talked at the top of the episode about your personal story and struggles with anxiety, which I think a lot of people will identify with.
Yes.
Are there any other ways that you have seen where people often mask suppressed anger, or that will show up in other ways for people outside of anxiety?
I'll give you one more from myself.
Yeah, please.
You ever grind your teeth?
Oh, so much. Yeah, especially when I'm going through a stressful time.
Right.
Oh,
And so I did this for years. I'd wake up feeling like I'd been punched.
yeah.
Check with my partner. She definitely hadn't punched me on sleep. So, and you take that to a doctor or you look it up on the internet and they say, well, it's normally caused by stress or anxiety.
Yeah.
And what do you do when you find out something's caused by stress or anxiety? You get more stressed and anxious about that thing. So I was in this loop of like, what do I do about grinding my teeth for years? That was something else that when I started working on anger went away.
Wow.
And I don't do it. And, my leg used to go like this all the time. You see guys particularly do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's oversimplifying it somewhat, but in some instances, when your body shows signs of stress and anxiety, I think it's anger trying to leave your body.
Yeah.
It's anger that wants to be expressed that isn't being. And so it can manifest as physical symptoms. And that will be slightly different for everyone. But in terms of how anger repression can show up for other people, something very common with women is that they will cry when they get angry, which can be really frustrating in a professional context because somebody can make you angry and then you react by crying, not deliberately. It's just what happens.
Wow.
And that can kind of undermine your authority, or it can just lead to confusing responses in people. And this is where we get into racket emotions and, the way that we replace an emotion that we've internalized as being inappropriate, i.e. anger, and we replace it with an emotion that we think is socially acceptable.
Yeah.
So that could be anxiety. For women, it can be sadness.
It's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it. But if I think about violence, that is often viewed as a strength. And if I think about tears, that's viewed as a weakness. And if you think about that in a professional context, right? Violence is a scale. And, I've seen it myself where like a male leader might slam his hand down on the boardroom table to showcase a point, right?
Right.
That's often seen as strength, but I don't think it is strength. That's just, it's like misaligned emotion. It can be quite intimidating for a lot of people.
Yeah, I describe that as aggression maybe more than violence.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. And I think a useful way to think of aggression, hey, look, aggression can be useful. Of course it can. And it can be appropriate. More often, I'd say it isn't.
Yeah.
And I think a better way to think of aggression is like, rather than it's like the most honest expression of anger or its natural endpoint or something like that, it's a rejection of anger. It's actually a rejection of the insecurity or the pain or the fear or whatever it is that anger is pointing you towards. And so men in particular rush to aggression because it's a more comfortable thing to do than sit with the anger and think about what it's really saying, particularly what it might be saying about you.
Yeah.
So I see aggressive behavior most of the time as a rejection of anger rather than rather than its truest face, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And why do you think that, you talked about women, but it can be both genders, why expressions of sadness, like tears, for example,
Mm.
why are they viewed in a different way to those sort of more obvious expressions of anger?
Why would people view the tears
Yeah,
less favorably than?
in a professional context.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it goes back to, a lot of the mental health conversation of I think we've lived through a mental health revolution, really, haven't we, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, and taking the shame out of sadness and depression
Mhm.
has been a big part of that. Nevertheless, I think that a lot of that lingers, this idea that if you're sad, you're weak.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for women too. I know traditionally, it's boys don't cry and so on. But I think for a woman in a professional context to cry without wanting, without meaning to, can be really, really troubling and tricky. And look, there are men who do that too.
Yeah.
But yeah, racket emotions, the way we cover anger with other expressions can be super confusing and really unhelpful for people in lots of different ways.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about anger in the context of romantic relationships, because
Yes.
I think that's going to be the most relatable um, sort of part of anger for a lot of people that are listening. And specifically, if you're a partner that finds yourself on the receiving end of anger,
Mm.
how do you go about navigating that in a safe way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, nobody should tolerate being trapped with aggression or violence, of course. It's interesting if you read the research of the Gottmans, that famous couple.
Yeah, I adore them.
Yeah,
The-
it's fascinating their work, and they talk about the horsemen of the apocalypse of a relationship or something like that.
right.
So the signs that a relationship is doomed. And I think they famously say they can tell by watching a couple within 10 minutes if they're likely to survive or not
Right.
as a married couple.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest red flags, they argue, is contempt. And so if a couple are talking to each other with contempt, or one is talking to the other with contempt, that's a terrible sign for that relationship.
Mm.
And what is contempt? It's sort of anger that's been allowed to fester and toxify and turn from frustration, normal, healthy amounts of frustration, into something punitive and nasty and all of those sorts of things. So if you have a relationship where your anger doesn't have a healthy and proportionate expression, whether you're on the receiving end of that or you're kind of giving it back, you're in a really bad place in that relationship. And so having the ability to express anger properly within a relationship is so much more important than I think people even realize.
Yeah.
Um, and again, we tend to talk about the very extreme cases where there's domestic violence or there's something like that going on. But I think there's also another level of it, which is a little bit, lower temperature in some ways, but it is that, like, talking to each other with contempt and a lack of respect. And it's all a kind of a toxified version of anger that is really there because people don't know how to express their frustrations with each other properly.
Yeah.
So it is such an important thing and very difficult thing to get right, but it's an important thing to work out, I think.
I just think it's sort of quite a difficult topic, because I think I'm trying to think about times when my other half might feel anger and how to allow her,
Mm.
a space to express that. But equally, part of me is like, well, it's not my responsibility.
Yeah, I agree. I do think the responsibility, that we're all responsible for our own feelings. We're all responsible for our own anger. I think if you can, and this is difficult again, but if you can learn to say to the person that you're angry with, it's called the discomfort caveat, is what they call it. You can confess up front, I'm really angry. So I'm not going to articulate myself super well right now.
Yeah.
You got to bear with me. Nevertheless, and then get into what it is you're angry about. At the very least, you're making like an appeal for empathy at the top. And I think as a recipient of that, if you can have the presence of mind to make some allowance for the fact that someone is angry, and so therefore they're scrambled, and they're not gonna say things that are super considered, and their arguments aren't going to be super uh, rational all the time. Challenging to do, but at least that way you can create the space for the anger without taking it literally or taking it too seriously, if that makes
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
and then come back to it later.
Have you found your ability to deal with anger with your partner's improved since you've been reading about it.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, and as I say, you know, we've had a lot of those conversations about our kind of triggers and what it is that frustrates us, and you know, that doesn't just apply to anger. It's also like what makes you anxious, what makes you scared. You know, they're important things to know as well. I don't think any couple cracks this. You
Yeah.
know, in fact, some couples have the opposite problem to the one we're talking about, which is that they can't seem to argue,
Right.
and that's actually super weird and inauthentic
I
as
wonder
well.
what the Gottmans would have to say about that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure they'll have plenty, but
Mm.
it's that kind of you know, when you're with your partner and like you know there's an argument that needs to be had,
Yeah.
and you haven't had it yet, and then suddenly like everything can get really tense, you know, just like passing the remote control. So suddenly you'd be quite weird and tense. You know, it's because there's an argument that you need to have that you haven't had yet, and so yeah, there's the problem of de-escalation and how do you handle things when they've gone too far or someone's lost their temper, but I think there's also the issue of like, how do you confront a problem head on when you can feel it kind of bubbling up?
Yeah.
And that also can be really tough.
I think it's one of the most attractive things you can do as a partner is understand when there's that underlying tension or that conflict situation which is about to come and say, I want to address this now.
Yeah.
But it can be very difficult to do that because, you know, you don't want to rock the boat, or sometimes you might have created a situation in your head which is bigger than your partner interprets it as being.
Absolutely.
You know?
And, you know, again, like starting with an appeal for empathy,
Yeah.
you know, it's that old advice of use me statements, not you statements.
Yeah.
You know, I've been feeling this way recently is a much better way into that than you've been doing this recently.
Yeah.
You're still getting at the same stuff. You're starting from a more collaborative vantage point, I suppose. But again, that comes back to that thing of like, be proactive. Don't let anger be a taboo within your household, within your relationship. Be on the front foot with it. And actually, it can be a really interesting conversation to get into with someone.
Yeah.
You know, when you start talking about what makes people angry, you're pretty close to their values. You're pretty close to what matters to them. You know, it's
Wow.
not a negative conversation by default. It just gets that way if you let it fester for too long.
I mean, I think everything I've learned from this episode so far makes me think that actually being able to reflect on my relationship with it is, you know, it shows a level of self-awareness, which is the same as showing self-awareness about where every other behavior that you have as a human being comes from, you know, and a lot of the time, as we've spoken about in this series so many times before, it comes from your childhood and the things that you fear or you're scared of, you know. Got a controversial question for you.
Go on.
Can anger ever be attractive?
In a sort of sexual sense?
Yeah.
Well, something I look at in the book that there isn't as much research on as you might think is the idea of makeup sex.
Right. Okay.
You know, which is you know, that idea that you know, you're sort of more attracted to each other when you've had a falling out.
Yeah.
The actual hard science on that is pretty scant.
Right.
And
Just speaking from personal experience.
from what I've read, and yeah, it's there isn't a lot of research that's been done into it, but for sure it's true for a lot of people. But then for some people, it doesn't seem to be as true.
Yeah.
But what is true is that, you know, every relationship has this ongoing rupture and repair continuum, you know, and a healthy relationship will swing between the two.
Yeah.
And there's something about being in the rupture state where you've asserted your own autonomy in some way, whether that's an argument or you've just been away for a week or whatever it is,
Right.
that gives the other person that sort of, you know, almost they become novel again in some way, right?
Totally.
And so anger can play a part in that sort of symphony, in that, you know, when you break apart temporarily because you've had an argument, you get a sense of what life might be like without them.
Yeah.
And so then returning to them becomes sort of more charged.
Absolutely.
So I think in that sense, it's not quite what you're saying, but I think anger can play a role in attractiveness in that sense.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that's the same thing as like it's hot to be, you know, aggressive or anything.
Yeah.
But hey, you know, some people might think that.
I'll be honest, mate, like that's where my brain took me, was kind of this idea of, and maybe it's more appropriate to say this for a generation before our generation, but where, you know, traditionally women might find men that are going out and having scraps or showcasing aggressive behavior is a sign that they're able to physically protect you. And whether or not that might actually play a role in people sometimes looking at anger as being a positive thing.
Yeah. And I think, look, assertiveness is attractive, and assertiveness is controlled anger,
Yes.
you know? And there is something very attractive in men and women about um, measured, clear, strongly expressed anger that says its piece and then doesn't keep banging on about it and doesn't go excessively punitive,
Yeah.
but also doesn't hold back. People say to me, what is good anger? And like the best way I can define it is that it's when you feel it without shame or fear and you express it proportionately in a way that makes the situation better, not worse.
Yeah.
That's kind of what a good leader does, right?
Right.
And so that's good anger, and I think that's attractive. That's
Yeah.
that's assertive, and it's strong, and it's those things. So maybe that is the emotional equivalent of the physical prowess that you're kind of getting at.
Sure,
You know?
sure. The expression "men used to go to war" springs to mind, you
Yeah.
know, and
And now we sit on podcasts.
well, exactly. And I do have a kind of slightly toxic belief that, yeah, the comfort that we experience as men or as humans more generally sometimes means that we don't lean into these emotions because everything's just handed to us on a plate.
Yeah, I go along with that to an extent. But I think, look, there's no shortage of men out there getting angry and aggressive and violent. You know, that is a huge problem. And you know, my book is more focused on the other problem of suppression and repression and how do you contact anger if you struggle with it. But as we all know, there are plenty of people on the other end of the spectrum, and they take up a lot of oxygen and energy in culture and in society, and you only have to put the news on for 5 minutes to see evidence of that.
Yeah.
So you know, I personally don't think there's a lack of opportunities, sadly, for men to engage in sort of that end of the emotion. And then there's sport and everything else. And, you know, there's lots of ways that people find to contact that part of themselves.
Yeah.
I don't think we have to go to war to do that, thankfully.
But yeah, this has been fascinating. Thank you. My final question, I just wanted to ask, are there any other big themes or topics that you talk about in the book which we might not have covered?
One thing that I think is very pertinent to the anger conversation, and unfortunately it comes up when you talk about anything now, is social media
Right.
and life online. And, you know, why is it that everybody seems so angry in our online spaces? Whether it's like your distant cousin.
I wish we'd started with this one.
You know, whether it's your distant cousin on Facebook talking about their bin collection, or whether it's, you know, people falling out on X when people still use that. And,
Yeah.
you know, there seems to be anger everywhere. And there's a chapter in the book where I try and explore what healthy anger, what good anger might look like online. And it's the only area of life that it's almost impossible to find
Yeah.
a good example of. And the reason I think is this, is that a cathartic and healthy use of anger, if you and I fell out and you were angry with me or vice versa, the way that is put to good use is that we have a constructive conversation from a point of empathy where we both say our piece and then we agree on a way forward defined by mutual respect or something like that.
Very rational.
Right. That's the ideal. That's the platonic ideal of how we should use our anger socially. All you get online is the expression bit, the ventilation, which has the illusion of being cathartic and of getting you somewhere, but it doesn't. And how many times have people on social media had the constructive conversation and agreed? Never, not once probably in the history of the internet. And so we're kind of just caught in this fog of expressed anger that doesn't get to have its sort of resolution to it. And so there's this sort of illusion that we can go online and express our anger and that's going to make us feel better. It actually doesn't. You know, this has been studied. It actually keeps you mired in the feeling for longer.
Right.
So, yeah, I think you have to look at the intentions of the people who run our online spaces.
I'm pleased that you said that.
You know, there's a reason that Facebook prioritizes statuses that have attracted anger emojis,
Right.
because it keeps you longer on the platform.
Holy moly.
You know, and so there's lots of examples across all the platforms of ways that they do that,
Yeah.
prod and manipulate our anger.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you want a healthier relationship with anger, or you're interested in acquiring one, the last place you should go and try and do that is
Social media.
on Facebook or, yeah.
And I mean, I completely agree with you. The responsibility has to lie with the platforms. But I'm also interested in understanding the sort of more human psychology behind it, because my, again, anecdotal hypothesis would be content emojis, whatever, which communicate red emotions, let's call them that, people stay on that stuff for longer. They linger on it for longer. They find it more engaging, you know? And I don't know why that is. I don't know if you've got a point of view on that, but
I think it's because anger's always looking for a home. It's looking for a social discharge. It actually wants to be resolved, right? Like that's what that energy is, that scratchy feeling you were talking about. It's yearning for a resolution, to feel seen and respected, and to express your displeasure, and for it to be concluded healthily.
right.
You know, we're all being compelled towards that. We're just terrible at doing it. And so online, we just get stuck at the first sort of tasty bite of anger.
Yeah.
That's kind of tasty but not nourishing, you know. It's like a Big Mac or something. You know, but the other night I was doom scrolling, you know, because I was angry about what I was seeing happening in Minnesota, in America, like everybody was, I think. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, why am I looking for validation of the fact that I'm angry about it? Yes, on one level. Am I looking for someone who's going to tell me that it's actually going to be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, what I was being served were videos that were perpetuating the feeling.
Yeah.
And so you just get stuck in this loop, don't you?
Oh my God. I mean, I've got so much to say on that. I was texting some of my really close friends about that, because when I saw that video, it brought up a feeling which hadn't really felt for a long time when it comes to social media. And I think that's because I have a fairly good relationship with it. But it also brought up the visceral anger that I felt there, I think, was because it felt so relatable. And that then brought up this feeling of guilt where I was like, bad stuff is happening in the world all of the time. Why didn't I feel like that about Sudan or the Ukraine or Gaza? And it's because when I say relatable, the guy who was murdered, who was shot in the back, he looked, sounded, acted like me.
Yeah.
And so I think, to your point around validation or looking in the mirror, feeling seen with it, I was like, he's just like me. And that could happen to me, you know?
Yeah, and actually, you know, we haven't touched so much on identity, but one thing that I realized when I started exploring this topic and how I might get better at expressing anger was that it's not the same set of rules for everyone.
Yeah.
And so, you know, as a white man living in the West, I have a latitude to explore expressions of anger socially that's pretty wide. You know, I can be quite obnoxious in a social setting and get away with it, you know, and so I can experiment with being angry in that way. If I were black or a woman, the rules are very different. The rules of engagement are very different.
Yeah.
And so I think that becomes part of the prism through which we understand big political and social events as well. You know, how much are you allowed to express your rage at the world, and how will that be received by others?
Right.
Is very, very different for people. So, you know, this is why I think going back to that idea of your individual fingerprint with anger, and,
Yeah.
you know, for us, it might be all about our childhoods. For someone else in our culture, it might also be a hell of a lot about the way they're treated because of their identity and their expectations that exist of them socially, because of their ethnicity or gender or something else about their identity. So you really have to come at the conversation with quite an individualistic lens, I think.
Sure. And just to wrap up the social media point that you speak about in the book, what's the best advice for people? Is it just to stop scrolling?
I mean, you know, that's the obvious and simple one. And I think we're going through a cultural moment now where ditch your phone, be offline. You know, it's kind of the new face of wellness, isn't it? And
People are talking about it like it's the big new thing, and I'm like, this is what life was like before the
right, exactly. And you know, I'm trying to be better at that. I think we all are at the moment. So you know, the obvious advice is to just say switch it off. There's some use in the solidarity that you can feel in a particular moment, and maybe this goes back to what we were just touching on, sometimes about identity and so on. There can be a shared outrage that is in some way comforting, but it is so easy to slip past that into, you know, into what we're talking about, the doom scroll, as people call it, where you're really just reinforcing the emotion.
Yeah.
Be offline, learn to express your anger directly to people, be very slow and steady with that, experiment. I've said this a few times in different interviews, but someone said to me, if you're starting to use anger for the first time in your life intentionally, it's like driving a sports car without a license. Like, you're going to crash sometimes, you're going to stall the engine other times. And you have to really be patient with yourself as you learn how to do this thing, and you're going to mess up loads. And I have and continue to. So yeah, I think being patient with yourself as you learn to express your anger offline instead of online is part of it.
And also, just to add to that, I think the reason why on social media you get on this like hive mind, this sort of sheep mentality, where you just see a bunch of people that feel angry about something. You're like, yeah, you know what, I kind of feel angry about that as well. And then I suppose it's to the point you made earlier in the show. It's about checking yourself internally and thinking, well, why do I feel angry about that thing? Do I even have a right to feel angry about that thing, or do I just want to feel acknowledged by a bigger group of people?
How much of it belongs to the issue and how much of it is symbolic of something else?
Yeah, right.
And I think what happens politically a lot, and I think what's behind some of the division along political lines in our culture, is that we get angry at the other side, or people get angry at the other side. And some of that anger is about the issue and the disagreement, but a whole heap more of it is really about their own shit.
Yeah.
And they're projecting a lot of stuff onto it. And so it's really, really difficult to have that conversation with yourself. But it's like, how much of this anger belongs to the incident and how much of it is about something else that's going on with me?
Yeah.
And if more people were asking that question and getting real with themselves about it, I think there'd be a bit less political division in the world.
I think that's a really great way to wrap up the episode. Where can people find you?
So I write on Substack, actually a parenting Substack called The Good Father.
Yeah.
Good Anger is out in shops now. Paperback is out soon. You can find it on Amazon and all the usual places.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. Sounds been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And don't forget, guys, like, comment, subscribe. Any sort of action, massage, tunes to the show really, really helps boost us up the Spotify ratings. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you again next time.